Hi, friends, it's Ryan. Today for Northwest News Radio, I went out to the Seattle Joint Training Facility where some Seattle fire crews were learning how to drive the trucks on the driving range. But the big thing that was happening there today was that a team from General Motors, GM, was there to work with Seattle Fire on special training for firefighters on how to handle electric vehicle fires. Now, the idea was to share this with some local agencies, but what really surprised me was there were firefighters from as far away as Yakima and even Salem, Oregon, who were there for this training. And the people behind it, you'll hear from Joe McLean from GM, say it's important and they really want to spread the word on that because as we move away from gas powered vehicles to more hybrid and then eventually all electric or different forms of renewable energy for our transportation, this is going to be an issue for firefighters because they'll be facing different types of technology when there's an emergency. So we'll get a little peek at their classroom training. We'll talk to Joe McLean from GM, and then we'll get a look at one of those vehicles.
And that's exactly what we've done. So we'll talk about Ultium in a second, but in this array here, we've got the right drop delivery vans. They're in fleet customers' hands right now, so UPS, FedEx, US Postal Service is looking at it, and others. That's right now for fleet customers only. That's an all electric battery electric vehicle. You see any Rivian as well out on the road. Next to that is our Cruise Origin. That's a purpose-built, ground up, all electric autonomous vehicle. Our partners at Cruise right now are focused on the markets in San Francisco, Phoenix, and Austin, but also looking at markets in Dubai. All this is public knowledge, but electric vehicles, AVs go hand in hand. Next to that is the Hammer EV pickup truck.
And this is Joe McLean. He's a training lead here from GM to work with the Seattle Fire and the other agencies that are here at the training center, taking this training and learning about the number of vehicles that are going to grow on the road, these electric vehicles, and the safety concerns that they have if they have to fight a fire in them. Joe, why is this initiative such an important piece as GM grows its place in the EV market?
General Motors is committed not only to safe product and putting safe vehicles in consumers' hands and on the nation and the world's roadways, but also committed to the safety of the first responders and second responders that might be anticipated or expected to interact with these vehicles in the field. We are here to communicate, again, our commitment to safe product as well as the safety of first responders. We have done this nationwide. We're here in the Pacific Northwest, here in Seattle. We're hoping to get as much traction and awareness and raise understanding of what documentation, what information is already out there for public consumption, as well as professional organizations like firefighters and the fire service and public safety. But again, General Motors wants the public safety community, first responders, to understand how seriously we're taking this move towards electrification.
Now, I talked to a Seattle Fire captain. I'm sure you've worked with him, Chris Green, who runs the energy unit. And he made an interesting point that, they've been fighting combustion engine vehicle fires for nearly a century. And electric vehicles, it's a whole different approach because of the way they're designed. The batteries are in a different place. You had mentioned in the training different battery chemistry and that sort of thing. Without going through the entire training thing, just if you could sort of highlight a couple of the things that you point out to these first responders so they know what to look for.
So let's say, broadly speaking, first responders encompasses the fire service certainly, as well as first responders, EMTs, paramedics, and others that might be expected to respond if there is an incident or an accident involving an electric vehicle. Certainly fires are top of mind for a lot of people, and lithium-ion battery fires are different from gas-powered combustion engine vehicle fires. They're different. They burn hot, and they can burn long, and they take maybe significant resources, whether that's water or personnel, to address it. But we want people to be aware that there is a growing body of knowledge, a growing understanding within the fire service community and within all first responders that much of the response techniques and procedures that they've already been trained on are going to be exactly the same. They need to be aware, and we want them to consider, some differences in high voltage energy or, other things related to electrification. But much of what they've already been trained on is going to be exactly the same. And that's what the thrust of this training is.
And you made an interesting point inside in the classroom, and Captain Green talked about it as well. When you talked about things being colored orange, so it's something that they want to stay away from. He was talking about the difference, where they might in a combustion engine vehicle cut into the engine compartment, cut through cables. Those are considerations that you want to take a different approach with an EV, isn't it?
Yeah. So the industry has settled on the automotive industry. And again, thinking about energy storage systems and lithium-ion battery packs for things other than vehicles, but really the thrust of the training is on electrified vehicles. The color orange will identify the high voltage cabling, the high voltage components that we don't want anybody to pull on, try to cut, pry, pull, poke, break into. Those are potentially hazardous, and we label them orange. We put them in bright orange colors, and those are going to be in locations that aren't traditionally accessed to get people out of vehicles, to do what's called an extrication. We've got a vehicle, we've got a Hummer EV for people to touch and interact with, and I can show you that in a second, Ryan. But first responders get to see how the structure is exactly the same. And the high voltage power, the high voltage battery, because of its weight and because of its size, is almost universally going to be low in the vehicle. And again, it's positioned in a place that is at the level of the frame rails and below the level of where anybody might be expected to cut into or extricate and get people out of the vehicle. So again, the color orange identifying potentially hazardous, cabling or modules in the vehicle that we don't want anybody to touch, including first responders.
Absolutely. And, Captain Green also made the point that these cars are built with a ton of safeguards to protect against these things. And the other thing I keep thinking about, because we hear about it anecdotally, is, fire services that aren't necessarily trained on how to do these say, well, it's harder to put out one of these things, or it takes longer, or they're worried about putting water on, what's basically an all electric vehicle. But that's kind of a misconception, isn't it?
It's a different way to approach. So I don't want to, tell anybody what they're doing is absolutely wrong, but we want to communicate that these fires have a different characteristics. They do have different tendencies. And so the application of water is the best way to cool down the battery, because you can extinguish flames, you can extinguish fire, but you're not going to take out any of the energy or, the potential heat that is resident in those battery packs. And water is the only thing right now that will put out the heat and help extinguish the fire. What is anathema, and not something that a lot of firefighters want to even consider, is the idea of letting it burn. Again, we talk about this should enter into their calculus when they're addressing a fire situation, that if there's no risk of exposures to loss of life, loss of property damage, that you're trained as a firefighter to control exposures. If that's not a consideration, and again, we talk about being in resource-constrained environments, whether lack of hydration, low amounts of water, no access to water, personnel, time, it may be the safest thing to let the vehicle consume itself in a fire. And I'm telling you this because no insurance company is going to take a vehicle and want to put a vehicle that's been in a fire back into service. It's going to be scrapped anyway. It's going to be totaled. So unless you're trying to control for exposures, one of the things that should be entered into their calculations and addressing a fire is they may want to let it consume. And that has a benefit downstream as well. And I say downstream to the salvage yard operators, the tow truck operators. When you've got a vehicle that's got no more latent energy in it because you let it consume, it's now a safer product to handle and to deal with in the tow yards. So again, firefighters are trained and have been trained for over 100 years, to Captain Green's point, to attack a fire, put it out, and move on. Well, lithium-ion battery fires can often rekindle. They can often, restart if the vehicle's moved or jostled. But again, we try to enter in the conversation that it may be safest to let it burn.
And, that's another good point, too. It's not just the immediate response, but downstream, like you say, as it goes on the tow truck and to the yard and then off to get scrapped. Having that stuff, like you said, is probably a better approach if you're at less of a risk of the thing reigniting, right?
Absolutely. And again, it's a technique, it's a consideration that we bring into the conversation, and other professional standards development organizations within the fire service, NFPA, Underwriters Laboratory, are all taking a look at, codifying some approaches. But it's contrary to what many firefighters are trained or may even want to do. So it's a new way of addressing incidents, and that's what I want to say about that.
Fair enough. Well, the one other thing I wanted to ask you about is, as the market moves toward more hybrids and then eventually all electric vehicles, what should we as consumers be thinking about in an emergency situation like that?
Well, realize that these vehicles are built with safety in mind from the ground up. They're going to have all of the modern safety features and applications, whether it be standard airbags, roof rail airbags, crush zones. All the automakers, General Motors specifically, and that's who I'm coming from, is committed to the safety of the occupants in the vehicle. We've been dealing with electrification for decades, and we want the consumers to know that these vehicles, we're committed to the safety of the vehicles. As consumers, they should rest assured that the vehicles are safe to own and operate, and if there's an emergency, you could treat it not unlike and no different than you would if you had a car breakdown on the side of the road. I was asked this yesterday by somebody, a radio interviewer, how do you jumpstart an electric vehicle? And we want to raise the awareness and raise the level of education. There's no jumpstarting an electric vehicle, right? There's an electric motor or motors, and just raising people's awareness. So if I could plug 2 websites, Ryan, if I could. The first one is gmevfirstrespondertraining.com. It's a mouthful, but gmevfirstrespondertraining.com is where we have all the information on how to register for upcoming trainings, as well as other resources that people might want to inform themselves on. GM has also launched a world-class website called GM EV Live for consumers, not necessarily geared towards first responders, but if people want to know more about what it means to go electric, what it means to charge at home, at work, out in the public, those are all things that our trained specialists will very happily answer any questions that consumers have about the future of electrification.
Excellent. Joe McLean with GM. Thanks for that, Joe.
Thanks, Ryan.
So, Joe, we're in the training base. We're going to keep our voices down a little bit because there's an ongoing training behind you right over there. But this is a Chevy Bolt.
This is a Chevy Bolt EUV that we've taken on the training with us. And you can see inside the front hood the orange cablings that we talked about earlier. And we are proud to say that we've been to and trained over 2,500 different first responders, personnel, and each one of the departments that we train, we ask them to bring a sticker or a patch representing their unit, their organization, and this vehicle will go on tour with us for the remainder of it. And I think it just is emblematic of how extensive the reach has been.
Excellent. And so with these, as you mentioned, I'm assuming the batteries are underneath.
Yep. So the batteries in all of our electrified vehicles are going to be, because of their weight and their size, is going to be below the frame rail. And I can show you some of the rescue documents and some of the things, again, that are made public that you can get to from our websites, gmstc.com or gmevfirstrespondertraining.com. I'd like to leave you with a trifold before we leave today.
Okay.
It's got all those websites and information on it. But if you want to take a walk around and just get pictures of the stickers.
Yeah. They have been all over with this training, not just stickers, but they got the patches on the insides on the seats there. And unfortunately, my listeners are going to have to see me in the window reflected there. But that's okay. And of course, this is another thing that was talked about in the training, is for first responders to be able to identify an electric vehicle right away. Well, there's your first clue.
No tailpipe.
I was just about to say, you'll notice there's no exhaust pipe on the end there, which would be great for the 1950s police officers in my hometown who kept pulling my dad over because he loved to have loud pipes. So EVs are a great way to go to avoid that.